She was sold before she even understood what it meant to be free, before she had the chance to decide what love could feel like or what a future might hold for her. There was no ceremony of choice, no tender words whispered to her in secret, no glimpse of hope. There was only the sound of her father's voice, cold and commanding, telling her that she was no longer his daughter, but his bargaining chip. Her innocence, something she had been told her entire life was sacred, was transformed into currency to pay debts too deep to measure. She could still remember the moment the words left his mouth. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing down on her chest until she felt she might suffocate. He did not meet her eyes as he spoke. He looked past her as though she were already gone, already delivered into another man's hands. She wanted to scream, to plead for mercy, but her voice caught in her throat. What argument could she give? What power did she have? She had spent her life surrounded by the weight of poverty, the endless gnawing hunger of unpaid debts, the desperation of a family clawing just to survive. She had always known she was worth little in the world her father occupied, but to hear it confirmed, to be told that she was nothing more than a price to be paid, was a cruelty she could never have imagined. The man who was to claim her was not unknown. His name carried whispers that ran like cold rivers through the streets. He was the kind of man who commanded silence when he entered a room, whose presence alone made powerful men tremble and made the powerless fall to their knees. A billionaire whose empire stretched across continents. His wealth bought loyalty, and his cruelty bought fear. People said he was untouchable, that no one dared cross him because those who did were never heard from again. And yet it was not only his power that haunted her, it was the reason behind his choice. Why her? Why would a man with access to everything, with women of beauty and wealth at his feet, choose a girl like her, one who had known nothing but hunger and hardship? Was she simply a pawn in a game older than she could understand, a trophy to humiliate her father, a tool to bring her family to its knees? Or was it something far more sinister, something rooted not in revenge alone, but in secrets buried deeper than blood? Her heart refused to stop asking questions, even as she was dressed in white, her body wrapped in silk that felt more like a shroud than a gown. Every thread of the fabric itched against her skin, reminding her that this was not a celebration, not a wedding. It was an execution of her freedom. The veil pressed down on her like chains, her shoes clicked against the cold floor like the tolling of a bell, and each step forward toward the altar was another nail hammered into the coffin of her dreams. She wanted to run. She wanted to rip off the dress and flee into the night, never to look back. But she knew she had nowhere to go. Poverty had clipped her wings long before this night, and her father's enemies, now her husband's allies, would never let her escape. So she walked forward, trembling, her lips whispering silent prayers she no longer believed would be answered. And then she saw him. He stood at the end of the aisle, tall, immovable, carved from marble and shadow. His suit was flawless, his posture commanding, his gaze colder than the steel of a blade. He did not smile when he saw her approach. He did not soften, did not pretend that this was anything other than what it was, a transaction. His eyes stripped her bare, not with desire, but with possession, as though he were marking her in his mind as another piece added to his empire. She searched his face for any sign of warmth, any flicker of humanity, but found none. There was only calculation, strategy, vengeance. In that moment she realized that he did not see her as a woman, nor as a partner. To him, she was proof, proof of his victory, proof that he had broken his enemy by taking what was most precious to him. The vows were spoken, hollow words echoing in a room filled with men who carried guns beneath their suits and eyes that never left her. She said, "I do," with lips that trembled, her voice breaking under the weight of despair, while inside her heart screamed that she wanted nothing to do with this union. He said the same words, his tone steady, his voice unshaken, as though reciting terms of a contract he had already signed. When the priest declared them bound, she felt no joy, no spark of hope, only the crushing weight of chains that were now invisible but no less real. Afterward, she was led away, carried not into celebration, but into silence. The estate she entered was magnificent, sprawling, gilded with wealth she had never seen in her life, yet every glittering chandelier, every marble hall, every gilded door felt like another bar of a prison cell. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the emptiness, reminding her that she did not belong here. When he spoke to her that night, his words confirmed what she already knew. "You will stay here," he said, his voice low, dangerous, without the need to raise itself. "You will not try to leave. You will not defy me. My men have orders." The cold finality in his tone made her blood run cold. She wanted to tell him she would never obey, that she was not his to command, but her throat betrayed her, tightening until no words came. She could only glare at him, her fury trembling in her chest like an unspoken vow. His eyes flickered just for a moment, with something she could not name, something like recognition of the fire she held, even as she stood broken before him. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that mask of ice. That night, when the door closed behind him, she sat on the edge of a bed that felt more like a cage than a comfort. She did not cry. Her tears had dried long ago, in childhood nights when hunger gnawed and hope vanished. She did not scream. Her voice had been stolen the moment her father traded her life away. Instead, she made herself a silent promise. If she was to survive this marriage, she could not remain the fragile girl her family had raised. She would have to change, to harden, to become something more. Because though he thought he had purchased a docile pawn, he had unknowingly bound himself to a storm. And yet, beneath her anger, the questions continued to burn. Why her? Why would a man like him, powerful, merciless, untouchable, choose someone so small, so powerless, so seemingly insignificant? What did he see in her that was worth the cost of this cruel bargain? Could it be revenge alone? Or was there a secret hidden in his silence, a truth that connected them in ways she could not yet fathom? She did not know then that the answers would come, and that when they did, they would tear apart everything she thought she knew. The beginning of her marriage was not the start of a new life, but the death of the old one. And as she sat in that vast, silent room, staring at the shadows flickering on the walls, she realized that her story was no longer her own. She was a piece on his board, a pawn in his game of power. But pawns, she reminded herself, could sometimes survive when queens and kings had fallen. She would wait. She would watch. And when the moment came, she would strike. For though he thought he had married a victim, he had unknowingly bound himself to someone who would not break. And in that silence, in that prison made of marble and gold, the first sparks of defiance lit inside her. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet imagine, A love story born not from tenderness but from fire, a passion forged in chains and sharpened by secrets too dangerous to remain buried. She had grown up in a world where every breath was a reminder of debt, where hunger was not just an empty stomach, but a weight that pressed down on her chest each morning as she woke. From the moment she was old enough to understand what money was, she understood she did not have it. Her father's promises of better days were always drowned out by the sound of creditors pounding on the door, by whispers of enemies in the shadows, by the sigh of her mother's weary hands folding threadbare clothes that never seemed to last. The streets she walked were grey, lined with people who had learned to survive on scraps, and yet even among the poor, her family carried the heaviest chains. She was not just a girl, she was a burden to a man who measured everything in power and survival, a pawn he was grooming without her consent. Poverty shaped her, carved her into someone who could smile through despair, who could pretend that hope still lived in her chest even as it crumbled in silence. But deep inside, she carried one fragile dream, that someday she could escape, that she could carve out a life beyond debts, beyond violence, beyond the suffocating legacy of a family name that had brought her nothing but pain. Her body bore the evidence of struggle in small, invisible ways. Her hands, delicate at first glance, had grown strong from endless work, tending to whatever task kept food on the table. Her back knew the ache of bending too long, her eyes knew the sting of tears she refused to let fall. At night, when the city outside her window dimmed to silence, she would lie awake, imagining another life. She pictured herself in a small home, far from the reach of her father's dealings, where laughter could fill the air instead of shouting, where she could belong to herself, instead of to the debts he could never pay. But each morning reminded her that dreams were fragile things, too fragile for someone like her. Each day, she woke to the harsh truth that her life was not her own to keep. And then there was him. He was everything she was not. Powerful, untouchable, a man forged in fire and sharpened by loss. His name was spoken in hushed tones in every corner of the city, not because people loved him, but because they feared him. He was the kind of man who carried storms in his gaze, a billionaire whose empire stretched farther than her imagination could follow. Entire companies bent to his will, entire families whispered his name with dread. He was wealth and cruelty woven into one, a figure whose very presence commanded silence. Where she had known only scarcity, he had known excess. Where her life had been a desperate climb out of nothingness, his had been a descent into shadows, where every scar carved into his soul became another weapon in his arsenal. But power never comes without a price. Behind the glass towers of his empire, behind the glint of black cars and polished shoes, lay scars no amount of money could erase. He had lost people, brothers perhaps, or friends torn away by betrayal, and those wounds had carved into him deeper than any blade. He carried them silently, locking them behind the coldness of his eyes, behind the ruthless mask of a man who no longer allowed himself to feel. People said he was cruel because he wanted to be, but the truth was crueler still. He was ruthless because he had to be. He had built walls so high around his heart that no one could climb them, not allies, not rivals, not women who tried to soften his steel with touch or tenderness. He did not trust, because trust had once cost him everything. Their worlds were never meant to collide. She was a girl with nothing but dreams and debts. He was a man with everything except peace. And yet, when her father handed her over, when her innocence was sold as though it were another coin in his pocket, destiny forced them into the same orbit. She hated him before she even spoke to him, hated him for what he represented: power that crushed, wealth that corrupted, silence that suffocated. He saw her and did not see a woman, did not see her suffering, did not see the fragility of her hope. He saw only leverage, a symbol, a piece on the chessboard of revenge. To him, she was not a bride, not a partner, but a weapon aimed at the heart of his enemy. And yet, behind the walls of cruelty, there was something more. Something even she could not deny when she looked into his eyes. For beneath the ice, there was grief. She saw it in the rare moments when his mask slipped, in the way his gaze sometimes lingered too long on nothing, as though he were remembering someone who would never return. His silence was not always coldness. It was the language of pain, spoken by a man who had been burned too many times to speak openly. She began to wonder if his cruelty was not an act of hatred, but an act of survival. Perhaps he did not lash out because he loved power, but because power was the only thing that kept him from falling apart. For her, this realization was more dangerous than his threats. She wanted to despise him, needed to despise him, because hatred made her strong. Hatred made her believe she could endure his presence, endure the cage he had built around her. But the moment she saw his scars, the moment she glimpsed the shadow of grief in his eyes, her heart faltered. Against her will, against every promise she had made to herself, something inside her stirred. It was not love, not yet. It was curiosity, dangerous and fragile. She wanted to know what had broken him, what had carved him into the man the world feared. She wanted to understand, even if understanding meant risking her own heart. Her family's poverty had taught her to be resilient, to bend without breaking, but this was a new kind of battle. She was now living under the roof of a man whose wealth could buy nations, whose cruelty could silence armies, and yet who carried grief heavy enough to drown him. She began to realize that her story was not only about her own survival anymore. It was about discovering what role she truly played in his. Was she a pawn to be discarded once she had served her purpose, or was she something else entirely? Every step she took in his mansion reminded her of the contrast between them. She walked past marble floors, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with paintings older than her family's entire lineage. She touched fabrics softer than anything she had ever worn, sat at tables where food overflowed, even though she could barely eat from the weight of despair pressing on her chest. To anyone else, this life might have seemed like salvation, an escape from hunger, a chance to finally live surrounded by beauty. But to her, it was a cage made of gold, each luxury another reminder that her freedom had been stolen. And yet, despite herself, she kept returning to the same thought. Why her? Why would he choose a girl who had nothing, who was born into scarcity, who had no beauty to rival the women he could have claimed, no power to match his, no wealth to offer him? The question gnawed at her until it became unbearable. Was it only revenge? Or was there something about her that tied into the scars he carried? She did not know then, but she would learn soon enough. The secret behind his cruelty, the secret behind her very existence, was darker and more dangerous than either of them had imagined. He remained a mystery she could not solve, a man who walked like a king but carried himself like a ghost. His presence filled every room, suffocating in its weight, yet his silences spoke louder than his words. And though she told herself she despised him, though she reminded herself that he was the enemy, her heart whispered what her mind refused to accept. Behind the monster, behind the billionaire cloaked in ice, was a man who had once been broken. And sometimes, in the moments when his eyes met hers, she wondered if he was not only her captor, but also the only one who could understand the shadows that had haunted her all her life. The first time they stood face to face as husband and wife, the air itself seemed to recoil, thick with a silence so sharp it could slice through flesh. She walked toward him down the narrow aisle, her gown trailing behind her like a river of ghosts, every step pulled not by will but by obligation. She kept her chin high because it was the only weapon she had left, but inside, her heart thundered against her ribs like a trapped bird. He stood waiting at the altar, broad-shouldered, his dark suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. To those who witnessed the union, he appeared like a man in full command of the world. But to her, his eyes revealed a storm she could not yet name. He did not smile as she approached. He did not soften when she trembled. His gaze cut through her like a blade, cold and unrelenting, as if he were appraising a possession rather than welcoming a bride. The vows that followed were not a promise of love, but a contract spoken aloud. She whispered, "I do," with lips that trembled, tasting ashes instead of hope, while his voice carried no hesitation, no affection, only the precision of a man confirming a deal. The guests applauded politely, but there was no warmth in the room, only the hum of power shifting from one family to another. When the priest declared them bound, she felt her freedom extinguish, as though a door had slammed shut behind her forever. She did not look at him as they left the chapel. She could not bear to. The estate was grander than anything she had ever seen, but its beauty felt suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast their glitter across marble floors, velvet drapes swayed like silent witnesses, and guards lined the hallways with eyes sharp as knives. Every corner whispered of wealth, yet she could feel the invisible bars of her new prison pressing in. That first night, he led her to a room that looked more like a cage disguised in luxury. A bed large enough for two, wardrobes filled with clothes she had never chosen, a view of gardens manicured into perfection. He gave no tour, no words of comfort, only instructions spoken with the weight of finality. "You will stay here. You will not attempt to leave. My men have orders." She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms, swallowing the scream that rose in her throat. She wanted to tell him she was not an object, not his possession, not the leverage he imagined her to be, but the words never escaped. She met his gaze instead, defiant, despite her fear, and for a fleeting instant something flickered in his eyes, an almost imperceptible recognition of her fire. Then it was gone, shuttered by the cold mask he wore like armor. He turned and left her standing in that opulent prison, the echo of the closing door louder than any shout. Hours passed, but sleep never came. The silence gnawed at her until it became unbearable. Finally, when the house had quieted and only shadows remained awake, she made her move. Barefoot, she slipped through the hallways, her breath shallow, her heart hammering. She had no plan beyond escape. All she knew was that she could not remain caged. She pressed herself against cold walls, praying that the guards would not notice, her body trembling each time the floor creaked beneath her weight. The night air smelled of freedom, of possibilities waiting just beyond the gates. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. Running far enough that his power could not touch her, shedding the name she had been forced to take, building a life of her own somewhere the past could not reach. But freedom was a cruel illusion. Before she reached the gates, before her fingers even brushed the cold iron, he was there. He emerged from the shadows as though he had been waiting, his presence filling the night like a storm gathering strength. His eyes glimmered with something between anger and amusement, and when he spoke, his voice was as low and sharp as a blade drawn in darkness. "You are not a wife," he said evenly, each word deliberate. "You are leverage, and leverage does not run." The words struck harder than chains. Her body froze, her heart collapsing into despair, but her spirit refused to bow. "I am not your pawn," she spat, her voice breaking, yet strong enough to echo in the night. "You can cage me, but you cannot own me." Her defiance lit the air between them like sparks, and for the first time he seemed taken aback. He studied her, his jaw tight, his gaze narrowing, as though he had not expected the girl he thought he bought to speak with fire. For a heartbeat they stood in silence, two wills clashing without weapons. She expected cruelty in his eyes, expected him to drag her back in chains. Instead, she saw something fractured, a shadow of pain buried deep beneath his mask. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to unsettle her resolve. She should have hated him, should have recoiled, but the glimpse of brokenness beneath his cruelty caught her off guard, and though she wanted to deny it, her heart faltered. He stepped closer, his voice dropping lower, almost intimate in its severity. "Do not mistake survival for choice," he said. "The moment you think you can run, you will be destroyed. Not by me, but by the world you know nothing about." His words were not a threat, but a warning, and that made them even more terrifying. She wanted to scream at him, to reject the twisted logic he wielded like a weapon, but something in his tone told her that he spoke from experience. He turned then, leaving her standing in the cold night, her chest rising and falling with the force of her rage. She did not follow him back to the mansion. She walked slowly, her mind reeling, her heart torn between hatred and a dangerous curiosity. He was a monster, yes, but monsters were not born, they were made. And the man she had been forced to marry carried scars deeper than she could yet see. From that night forward, every time she looked at him, she could no longer see only cruelty. She saw the fractures in his armor, the shadows in his silence, and it terrified her. Because hatred was easy, it kept her strong. But the moment she began to wonder what pain lay behind his eyes, she risked losing the only shield she had left. And so the battle between them began, not only of power and defiance, but of hearts drawn together against every reason to stay apart. It was in that first confrontation, in the midnight silence of a gilded prison, that their story truly began. They were no longer simply captor and captive, not merely enemy and pawn. They were fire and ice colliding, bound by chains neither of them could break. And though neither would admit it aloud, something had ignited in that clash of wills, something dangerous, something impossible to ignore. For when their eyes locked in the darkness, the world around them shifted. The war between them had only just begun, but hidden beneath the hatred was a spark neither cruelty nor despair could extinguish. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something far more powerful, something that would either destroy them or redefine them forever. The mansion was a labyrinth, a palace of silence, where every corner seemed to watch her. Days bled into nights, and the longer she stayed, the more she felt the weight of invisible chains pressing on her shoulders. At first, she thought her room was only temporary confinement, a gesture of power meant to remind her of her place. But as time passed, she realized it was more than that. It was a gilded prison, crafted not of iron bars, but of velvet drapes and locked doors. She was free to walk the hallways, yes, but freedom meant nothing when every window was sealed, every gate guarded, and every glance from the staff reminded her that she was a guest only in name. She had been taken, not welcomed, bound by vows that meant nothing more than ownership. It was during those endless nights of pacing that she found the courage to explore. Curiosity was her rebellion, and it led her deeper into places she was not meant to see. One evening, while the house was hushed in darkness, she followed a faint draught to a hallway she had never noticed before. At the end of it, a door stood slightly ajar, the glow of a desk lamp spilling out like a lure. Against her better judgment, she slipped inside. The air smelled of leather and ink, of secrets pressed into paper. Shelves stretched high with books, but it was the desk that caught her eye, cluttered with folders marked by names that felt like ghosts. Her breath caught when she saw her own name printed neatly on a manila folder. Hands trembling, she opened it, expecting only simple records. What she found instead shattered her world. Her birth certificate, but not as she knew it. The line for father was blank. Her mind spun as she flipped through the documents. Letters between men she had never met, contracts signed in blood, whispers of adoption she had never been told about. The man who raised her, the one who had sold her into this marriage, might not even have been her father at all. And suddenly, everything made sense. Why she had always been kept hidden, why her father's eyes never softened when he looked at her, why he could give her away as though she were nothing. She was not his child, she was his leverage. Rage surged in her chest, so fierce she could hardly breathe. She wanted to scream, to burn the papers, to storm into the night and demand the truth. But instead she pressed the documents back into the folder, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely close it. She had seen too much already. The sound of footsteps behind her froze her blood. She turned, expecting a guard, perhaps even her captor himself. And there he was, framed in the doorway, his eyes sharp, his face unreadable. He did not ask how she had gotten inside. He did not need to. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low, steady, but heavy with warning. She clenched her fists, lifting her chin. "Enough to know my life is not what I thought it was," she whispered. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might strike her. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze drilling into hers. "Secrets are more dangerous than bullets," he said, "and you've just picked up a loaded gun." Then he turned and left, his words echoing like a curse. The following days were unbearable. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling like a stranger. Her life had been built on lies, her very name stitched from threads of deception. And yet, what pained her most was not the discovery itself. It was the silence he carried with him. He knew. He had always known. Every time his gaze lingered on her, every time his voice sharpened when he spoke her name, she realized it had not been cruelty alone. It had been recognition. He had known who she was, or perhaps what she was, long before she ever did. and the betrayal cut deeper than any chain her father had bound her with. Still, her anger did not erase her confusion, for with each confrontation, with each heated exchange, she began to see something else in him. He was not a man untouched by pain. He was a man drowning in it. She discovered the photograph of a brother, lost in a betrayal that had left scars no wealth could heal. She heard whispers of nights spent alone in his study, drinking in silence, mourning a life stolen from him. His cruelty, she began to realize, was not born of joy. It was born of survival. He had become ruthless because the world had demanded it of him, because without the mask of coldness he would have shattered long ago. And that realization terrified her. Hatred was a shield, easy to hold, steady in its weight. But the moment she began to understand him, the moment she saw the cracks in his armor, her shield began to slip. Her heart, treacherous and unbidden, started to beat differently in his presence. She found herself searching for the softness he tried so hard to bury, catching glimpses of humanity in the shadows of his grief. It was madness. He was her captor, her enemy, the man who had stolen her freedom. And yet, when he looked at her with eyes darkened by sorrow rather than cruelty, she felt something she could not explain. Their clashes grew more violent as the truth pressed harder against them. She accused him of using her, of turning her into nothing more than a pawn. He shot back that pawns sometimes survived when queens were sacrificed, his words cutting but not without meaning. She shouted that she hated him, and though he did not respond, his silence carried more weight than words. In those moments, she saw him not as a monster, but as a man fractured by loss, fighting to keep control of a world built on betrayal. The tension between them became unbearable, their words like weapons, their silence even sharper. And yet, beneath every argument, beneath every glare, something else was growing. She told herself it was impossible, that her heart was betraying her reason. But the truth was undeniable. She was no longer certain whether she wanted to destroy him or to save him. She no longer knew if she was fighting against him or against the feelings rising within her. The mansion became their battlefield, each hallway echoing with their conflict, each room heavy with secrets that refused to stay buried. She felt like she was walking a tightrope between love and hate, unable to step back, unable to move forward without falling. He, too, seemed torn, his mask slipping more often, his words carrying the weight of truths he did not want to speak. Sometimes, late at night, she would find him standing alone on the balcony, staring into the darkness as though searching for a ghost. And though she wanted to turn away, she always lingered, watching him, wondering what kind of man he might have been had the world not broken him. It was in those quiet moments that she realized the truth of her own heart. She could not hate him entirely, and that terrified her more than any secret she had uncovered, because now the question was no longer who she was or where she had come from. The question was what they were becoming together. Were they destined to destroy each other, two souls bound by lies and vengeance? Or were they, against all reason, the only salvation either of them would ever know? The storm that had been brewing between them could no longer be contained. For days, tension had stretched like a taut wire between their hearts, every glance charged with unspoken truths, every silence louder than screams. And then, in one shattering moment, the wire snapped. It began with a letter, hidden in the bottom drawer of his study, written in a hand she recognized only from faint childhood memories. The delicate curves of ink belonged to her mother, a woman she had been told was long dead. Her breath caught as she read words that made her blood run cold, confessions of love, fear, betrayal, and a name that changed everything. Her mother had not belonged to the man she called father. She had belonged to someone else, someone tied to him, the very man who now claimed her as his wife. Her vision blurred as the truth struck with merciless force. The marriage that had begun as a transaction already tainted by lies was far more twisted than she could ever have imagined. She was not merely a pawn between two rival families. She was the child of a love forbidden, a legacy buried to protect reputations and power. Her existence was the scar of a secret war, and her life had been orchestrated, from birth to this moment, to serve as leverage in games of vengeance. She felt her body tremble, her knees threatening to give way, but she forced herself to stand. With the letter clutched in her hand like a blade, she stormed into the hall, her voice breaking through the heavy silence of the mansion as she cried his name. When he appeared, framed by the dim light of the corridor, his expression told her everything he had known. The mask he wore every day, the ruthless calm, the unshakable control, could not hide the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You knew," she whispered, her voice a mixture of fury and grief. "All this time you knew who I was, what I was, and you said nothing." The letter shook in her hand, the ink smudged by her trembling fingers. He did not move to take it, nor did he deny it. His silence was confirmation, and it cut deeper than any lie. Her fury erupted, raw and merciless. She struck him with words like fire, accusing him of cruelty, of betrayal, of turning her life into a weapon. He did not shout back. Instead, he listened, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with shadows of regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, but thick with the weight of confession. "I knew," he admitted. "I knew before you ever walked into this house. I knew who your mother was. I knew the truth they buried to keep you hidden. But I also knew what it would do to you if you found out. So I stayed silent." She recoiled as if struck. "You think you were protecting me?" she spat. "You think silence is mercy. You stole from me the only thing I had left, the truth." Her voice broke on the last word, her chest heaving with sobs she tried to smother. He stepped closer, but she raised her hand to stop him. Her tears were no longer fragile. They burned like acid. "I hate you," she whispered. "I hate that you control me, that you cage me, that you knew everything and let me walk into this like a lamb to slaughter." For the first time since she had known him, his mask shattered. His voice cracked, and the words that spilled from him were not calculated or cold, but raw, unguarded. "Do you think I wanted this?" he asked, his tone shaking with fury and sorrow. "Do you think I wanted to carry these scars, to bury my brother, to inherit a kingdom built on betrayal? You think I wanted you as another piece in this endless war? I married you because it was the only way to strike back at the man who destroyed everything I had left. But you—" He faltered, his breath trembling as he met her gaze. "You are not just a pawn. You were never just that. You are the one thing I did not plan for, the one truth I cannot fight." The silence that followed was suffocating. Her tears slid silently down her cheeks as she stared at him, torn between the hatred that kept her strong and the pull of something far more dangerous. Love. It should have been impossible. He was her captor, her enemy, the man who had bought her with vengeance. Yet beneath his cruelty lay a man broken by grief, and her heart, traitorous and unrelenting, saw him not only for what he was, but for what he had lost. The confrontation spiraled into something fiercer, their voices clashing like thunder. She told him she would never forgive him. He told her forgiveness was never what he sought. She swore she would escape him. He answered that he would never cage her again if she chose to leave. But if she stayed, she had to know the cost. Their words were weapons, but behind every strike lay the wounds of truths they could no longer deny. The hatred between them had become indistinguishable from desire, the fury in their eyes burning as brightly as the longing neither dared to speak. And then, in the heart of their rage, came the breaking point. She collapsed to her knees, the letter slipping from her grasp, her sobs racking her body. He moved forward, not with command, not with power, but with something that terrified her more than cruelty: gentleness. He knelt before her, his hands hovering as though afraid to touch her, his voice lowered to a whisper. "I never wanted to love you," he confessed, his words trembling. "I told myself I wouldn't. But every time you defy me, every time you stand unbroken in front of me, I see the fire I thought I lost when my brother died, and I cannot hate you, no matter how much I try." Her breath hitched, her sobs slowing as she met his gaze. For the first time she saw him stripped of all masks, all armor, all control. He was not the monster the world believed him to be. He was a man consumed by grief, shaped by betrayal, fighting to survive a legacy that had left him hollow. And in that moment she realized the truth she feared most. She did not hate him entirely. Her heart, battered and broken, still reached for him, still burned with something she could not extinguish. The fire between them was no longer just anger. It was passion, raw and consuming, a blaze that threatened to devour them both. Their love, if it could be called that, was born of lies, of hatred, of chains, and yet it was undeniable. She wanted to strike him, to curse him, to banish him from her heart. Instead, she found herself trembling not with rage, but with the terrifying pull of desire. Their love had become both a weapon and a wound, a force that seared them even as it illuminated the path before them. The night ended not with resolution, but with the unbearable truth. They could no longer separate hatred from longing. Their story had reached its highest point, the clash of vengeance and love, of betrayal and yearning. And as they stood amidst the ashes of their secrets, the question echoed like a thunderclap. Would this fire destroy them both, or would it forge them into something stronger than either had believed possible? The fire between them did not die after the night of revelations. It smouldered, burning deeper into their souls with every breath they shared. The mansion felt smaller now, its walls closer, as though even the house itself was aware of the truth that had been unleashed. Secrets once buried had clawed their way to the surface, and now the weight of those secrets pressed on both of them. They stood at a crossroads, their lives tangled in ways neither had chosen, and the question that lingered like a ghost between them was one neither could ignore. Was this love a prison, or the only freedom they would ever know? The following days were heavy with silence, but it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer a silence of cruelty and fear. It was the silence of two souls circling each other, unsure whether to surrender or strike. She walked the halls with a new fire in her eyes, no longer the timid girl brought there against her will, but a woman who had glimpsed the truth and refused to be broken by it. He watched her from the shadows, every glance filled with a tension he could no longer disguise. He had confessed more than he intended, revealed wounds he had spent years hiding, and in doing so, he had given her the power to destroy him. But instead of using that power to run, she remained, and that choice unsettled him more than her hatred ever could. One night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the sky, she confronted him again, though this time her voice carried not only anger, but something sharper, resolve. "We cannot keep living like this," she said, standing in the center of his study, the very room where so many lies had been born. "I am not your enemy, but I cannot be your prisoner either. If I stay, it will be by choice, not because you hold me here." Her words struck him harder than any blade, because they carried a truth he could not deny. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the pawn he had once claimed, not the fragile girl offered as payment, but a woman who had chosen to face him even when every reason told her to flee. He poured himself a drink, his hands steady though his heart was not. "If you walk away," he said softly, "I will not stop you. But if you stay, you must understand what it means. The world I live in does not forgive. Enemies will come for you, for us, and they will not care about love or truth. They will care only about blood." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then let them come," she answered. "I am done being afraid." Her words ignited something in him he had long believed dead. For years he had carried his grief like armor, convincing himself that love was weakness, that tenderness was a liability. But in her defiance, he saw not weakness, but strength. She was not there to save him, nor was she there to be saved. She was there because she chose to be. And that choice was more powerful than any vow spoken before an altar. The decision was made in silence, without ceremony, but it was no less binding than the vows that had once caged her. They would face the world together, not as captor and captive, not as enemies bound by vengeance, but as partners in defiance of the darkness that surrounded them. It was not an easy choice. There were nights when doubt clawed at her, when she wondered if she had traded one cage for another. There were moments when his temper flared, when his scars threatened to pull him back into the abyss of cruelty. But each time they returned to the same truth. Love, fragile and flawed as it was, had become their only weapon against the shadows. The enemies did come. Whispers turned to threats, threats to open confrontations. Rivals who had once feared him now saw opportunity in his vulnerability, in the woman at his side who had become his weakness and his strength. She stood with him through it all, her fire matching his steel, proving to both the world and to him that she was no pawn. She was a queen forged in fire, and together they faced storms that might have destroyed them had they stood alone. Yet even as they fought the battles outside, the greatest war remained within. Each night as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city, the question returned to her lips like a prayer. "Is this love a prison?" she would whisper, the wind carrying her words into the dark. And each night he would answer not with certainty, but with honesty. "It is both," he admitted once, his voice raw. It chains me and it frees me. It terrifies me and it saves me. But it is the only truth I have left." And in those words she found peace. Love was not meant to be perfect. It was meant to be chosen again and again, even when it hurt, even when it demanded everything. The story of their love did not end in fairy tales. It did not end in roses and laughter and happily ever after. It ended in defiance, in two people who chose each other even when the world told them they should not. Their scars did not disappear, they carried them proudly as proof of what they had survived. Their enemies did not vanish. They learned instead how to fight, not with fear, but with fire. And their love, born of lies and vengeance, became something truer than either had believed possible. On the final night, standing together in the quiet after the storm, she looked at him with tears in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of understanding. "I do not regret it," she whispered. "Not the pain, not the lies, not even the chains, because without them I would not have found you." His hand closed around hers, rough and steady, his eyes glimmering with a rare softness. "And I do not regret you," he replied. "You were the one thing I never planned, the one truth I never expected. And I will choose you, even if it destroys me." Their story was not one of innocence or purity. It was a story of fire and ash, of chains and freedom, of a love that burned in the darkest places and yet managed to create light. It left behind a question for anyone who dared to listen. When love demands everything, when it threatens to cage you and free you in the same breath, do you run from it, or do you surrender? They had chosen to surrender, and in that choice they found not perfection, but truth. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you that even in the darkest prisons, love can still spark a flame, then carry it with you. Share it with those who still believe in impossible love, who still dream of fire that does not only burn, but also illuminates. And if you believe, as they did, that love is worth fighting for even when it hurts, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the greatest freedom is found not in escape, but in choosing to love in the dark.